If you've ever wondered what would happen if somebody looked at a prison and said, "You know what this place needs? More silence," then welcome to Philadelphia. Today I'm standing in front of one of the most famous prisons in the world, Eastern State Penitentiary. At first glance, it doesn't even look like a prison. It looks more like a medieval castle that somebody accidentally dropped into the middle of Pennsylvania. Thick stone walls rise high above the street. Massive towers stand guard over every corner. Narrow windows stare down like watchful eyes. And even in broad daylight, there's something about this place that makes you instinctively lower your voice. I've visited a lot of haunted places over the years, but this one feels different before you ever hear a ghost story. You don't need someone jumping out yelling boo to understand that thousands of people suffered here. History hangs in these walls long before anyone starts talking about spirits. And that's exactly why I wanted to come here. Most people jump straight to the ghosts. They talk about shadow figures, mysterious laughter, footsteps echoing through empty corridors, or television shows spending the night inside these cell blocks. That's the fun part, and we're absolutely getting there. But if you skip everything that happened before the hauntings, you're missing the biggest story of all. Because Eastern State Penitentiary wasn't built to punish people. It was built to save their souls. Now, if you're thinking, well, that sounds like it probably didn't go according to plan, congratulations, you already know where this story is headed. Before there were prison walls, before there were cells, before anybody had even imagined a place like Eastern State, this land belonged to Native American peoples who had lived in the region for thousands of years. Long before Philadelphia became America's largest city for a time, southeastern Pennsylvania was home to the Lenape people, sometimes called the Delaware because European settlers later named the river after Lord Delaware. The Lenape lived throughout what is now eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and parts of New York. The land looked nothing like it does today. Instead of neighborhoods, highways, and brick buildings, this area was covered with dense forests, winding creeks, wetlands, and open meadows filled with wildlife. White-tailed deer wandered through the woods. Black bears lived throughout the region. Rivers were packed with fish, and the forests provided everything from walnuts and chestnuts to medicinal plants. The Lenape weren't wandering aimlessly through untouched wilderness like old Hollywood movies loved to portray. They had established villages, trade routes, agriculture, diplomacy, and sophisticated systems of government. Corn, beans, and squash, the famous Three Sisters, were staple crops, and communities traded goods over enormous distances. Sometimes, history books make it sound like Europeans arrived and magically discovered empty land. That's like walking into somebody else's living room, sitting on their couch, grabbing their remote, and announcing, "Good news, everybody, I found a house." History is a little more complicated than that. Everything began changing dramatically during the 1600s. European explorers, traders, and settlers increasingly entered the Delaware Valley. Disease spread through native communities. Trade transformed local economies. Conflicts over land became more common as colonial settlements expanded. Then came one of the most influential figures in Pennsylvania history. In 1681, King Charles II of England granted a massive tract of land to William Penn to settle a debt owed to Penn's father. Penn was a Quaker, a member of the Religious Society of Friends, and he envisioned something radical for its time, a colony based on religious tolerance rather than persecution. Pennsylvania wasn't perfect. No colony was. But compared to many others, William Penn made genuine efforts to negotiate land purchases with the Lenape instead of immediately taking territory by force. Historians still debate aspects of those agreements, and later generations certainly failed to maintain Penn's original ideals, but his early treaties were unusually peaceful by the standards of 17th century colonial America. The city Penn founded became Philadelphia. Its name comes from Greek words meaning brotherly love, which is nice. Although after driving through downtown traffic to get here today, I can report there are moments when the brotherly love appears to take a coffee break. Philadelphia grew astonishingly fast. Its location along the Delaware River made it one of the busiest ports in North America. Ships arrived carrying goods from Europe, the Caribbean, and other colonies. Merchants built fortunes. Craftsmen opened workshops. Immigrants poured into the city seeking opportunity. By the mid-1700s, Philadelphia had become one of the largest cities in the British Empire. It also became one of the birthplaces of the United States. Just a few miles from where I'm standing today, delegates debated independence. The Declaration of Independence was adopted in 1776. The Constitutional Convention met here in 1787. Names like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and James Madison all walked these same streets. While the country was inventing a new government, another question was quietly emerging. What should society do with criminals? That may sound like an obvious question today, but 250 years ago the answers were often horrifying. Prisons as we know them barely existed. Punishment was usually public. People were whipped, branded, locked in stocks, placed in pillories where crowds threw rotten food, or whatever else happened to be lying around. Honestly, social media comment sections would have fit right in. Public humiliation was considered part of justice. Executions were also common, even for crimes we'd consider relatively minor today. Many jails simply held people while they waited for trial or punishment. They weren't designed for rehabilitation. Inside those early jails, conditions were miserable. Men, women, children, debtors, violent offenders, and people accused of minor crimes might all be confined together. Disease spread rapidly, violence was common, corruption flourished. If you had enough money, your stay could become considerably more comfortable. If you didn't, good luck. Many reformers began asking whether there might be a better way. One group in particular became incredibly influential: the Quakers. Their beliefs emphasized equality before God, peace, reflection, honesty, and the possibility that every human being possessed an inner light. That philosophy extended even to criminals. Many Quakers believed crime wasn't simply something to punish. It was something people might genuinely repent for if given the right environment. Notice the word I used there, repent. That word eventually inspired an entirely new kind of institution. A penitentiary. The word comes from penitence. The original idea wasn't simply locking people away. It was creating a place where individuals could reflect deeply on their actions, reconnect with God, and emerge transformed into better people. On paper, it's actually a compassionate idea. The execution turned out to be far more complicated. During the late 18th century, reformers established organizations like the Philadelphia Society for alleviating the miseries of public prisons. Despite the long name, which definitely would have needed a shorter logo if they existed today, their mission was serious. Members inspected prisons, documented abuses, advocated for humane treatment, encouraged education, promoted prison reform throughout Pennsylvania. Their influence helped shape some of America's earliest experiments in incarceration. One important step came with the transformation of the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia during the 1790s. Officials attempted to separate prisoners and encourage solitary reflection. Initially, many observers praised the experiment. European governments even sent visitors to study what Philadelphia was doing, but problems emerged. The jail quickly became overcrowded. Facilities deteriorated. The original reform ideals became increasingly difficult to maintain. By the early 19th century, Pennsylvania officials realized they needed something entirely new, not simply another jail, an entirely different philosophy of imprisonment. A place designed from the ground up around isolation, order, religion, labor, and reflection. That vision eventually became Eastern State Penitentiary. The chosen site sat just outside Philadelphia's developed city limits at the time. Today, it's surrounded by neighborhoods, restaurants, apartments, and busy streets. But when planning began, this area offered room to build something unlike anything the world had ever seen, and they weren't thinking small. Officials wanted to create what many believed would become the most advanced prison on Earth. Construction began in 1821. The architect selected for the project was John Haviland, an English-born architect who had already designed several notable buildings in America. Haviland wasn't merely asked to draw prison walls. He was asked to create an entirely new concept. His answer would influence prison architecture across the globe. Instead of placing prisoners in large communal cell blocks, he designed a central hub with long wings radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. From above, the layout resembled a wagon wheel or the rays of the sun. Each cell block extended from a central observation point, allowing guards to monitor movement efficiently. This revolutionary radial plan became famous worldwide and inspired prisons in Europe, South America, Asia, and beyond. Even today, architects and historians still study its design. The walls themselves were astonishing, nearly 30 feet high, several feet thick, built from massive stone. Guard towers overlooked every approach. Visitors arriving during the 19th century often compared the complex to a medieval fortress. Which makes sense. Nothing says, spend some time thinking about your mistakes, quite like a castle that looks prepared to defend itself against dragons. But behind those imposing walls was something almost no prison offered at the time. Individual cells. Every prisoner would receive a private room, each included heat, running water, remarkably advanced for the era, a skylight, an exercise yard attached to the rear. A flush toilet was eventually incorporated into many cells as technology improved, another rarity in 19th century prisons. Compared to many prisons of the period, the physical accommodations were considered extraordinary. Visitors from around the world couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some described it as one of the most impressive public buildings in America. Others thought the entire idea bordered on madness. Because one detail overshadowed everything else, the prisoners would spend nearly every moment alone. Governments around the world were watching Philadelphia. Politicians, architects, judges, prison officials, and religious leaders wanted to see whether Pennsylvania had finally solved one of society's oldest problems. Could criminals actually change? Not through fear, not through beatings, not through public executions, but through silence. When Eastern State officially opened on October 25, 1829, it wasn't immediately filled with hundreds of prisoners. Officials brought inmates in gradually because this wasn't just another prison. It was an experiment unlike anything the world had ever seen. Every detail had been carefully planned, from the shape of the building to the way prisoners would walk down the hallways. The first inmate through the gates was Charles Williams, a young man convicted of stealing a wallet containing just over $3. It almost sounds funny now that the first prisoner in one of the world's most famous penitentiaries was a pickpocket instead of some notorious outlaw. Imagine becoming part of history because you couldn't resist somebody else's wallet. Somewhere along the line, he probably thought, "This is the worst day of my life." Little did he know historians would still be talking about him nearly 200 years later. Williams wasn't marched into a crowded cell block. He wasn't introduced to a cellmate. He wasn't thrown into a noisy room packed with hardened criminals. Instead, guards escorted him through spotless stone corridors to a single, heavy wooden door. When it swung open, he stepped into a room that would become his entire world. The cell itself was remarkably advanced for the early 19th century. It measured roughly 12 feet by 8 feet and had features that many ordinary Americans didn't enjoy in their own homes. There was a bed, a table for work, heating from a central system, and a small skylight directly overhead. Prison officials called that skylight the Eye of God. The symbolism wasn't subtle. As reformers saw it, even if no human being was watching, God always was. Every cell also connected to its own private exercise yard enclosed by high stone walls. Prisoners could step outside for fresh air each day without ever seeing another inmate. Even their moments outdoors were designed to reinforce solitude. When I first learned that, I had to laugh a little. Imagine telling somebody, "Good news, you get yard time," then opening the door to what basically looks like the world's saddest backyard patio. No basketball court, no conversations, no walking laps with friends, just you, four walls, and your own thoughts. After about 10 minutes, I'd probably be negotiating with squirrels. But to the prison's founders, this wasn't cruel, it was compassionate. That idea is difficult for us to understand today because we've grown up thinking of solitary confinement as one of the harshest punishments a prison can impose. In 1829, many reformers believed exactly the opposite. They believed isolation would protect prisoners. Most jails during this period were overcrowded, filthy, violent places where experienced criminals mixed freely with first-time offenders. Reformers argued that young offenders often entered jail guilty of one crime and left knowing 20 new ones after spending months around career criminals. Eastern State was supposed to stop that cycle. No criminal friendships, no gambling, no fighting, no gangs, no drinking, no plotting escapes, just quiet reflection. The philosophy became known as the Pennsylvania system, and it quickly attracted attention across the world. Every morning followed a carefully structured routine. Prisoners rose early, washed, prayed, and ate breakfast alone. Guards delivered meals through small openings in the doors, limiting conversation to only what was absolutely necessary. Inmates then spent much of the day working inside their cells. The prison wasn't designed for prisoners to simply sit and stare at walls all day. Officials believed honest labor built discipline and character. Depending on the prisoner's assignment, he might weave cloth, make shoes, repair furniture, manufacture brushes, or complete other skilled work. The products were sold, helping offset some of the prison's operating costs. The work also served another purpose. It kept minds occupied. Because here's something the prison's founders worried about almost immediately. What happens when somebody has nothing but time? Imagine spending weeks with no television, no radio, no books except the Bible and approved religious material, no conversations, no music, no letters arriving every day, no scrolling endlessly through your phone pretending you're just checking one notification before realizing it's somehow 2 hours later. Honestly, if Eastern State had existed today, confiscating smartphones would have been punishment enough for half the population. Instead, prisoners were expected to spend those long hours reflecting on the choices that had brought them there. Religion played an enormous role inside Eastern State. Chaplains regularly visited inmates individually. Since prisoners couldn't gather together for worship, religious instruction happened one person at a time. Reformers sincerely believed that crime resulted from moral failure and that genuine spiritual reflection could change even the most hardened offender. Some prisoners reportedly embraced that opportunity. Others almost certainly counted every minute until the day they could leave. One of the most fascinating things about Eastern State is how much thought went into preventing prisoners from communicating. If an inmate had to leave his cell for medical treatment, maintenance work, or another unavoidable reason, guards often placed a hood over his head before leading him through the corridors. These hoods prevented prisoners from recognizing one another or memorizing the layout of the prison. Officials feared that even brief eye contact might encourage friendships or conspiracies. Imagine that. You're walking through one of the most famous buildings in America, and you can't even look around because you've got what basically amounts to a burlap pillowcase over your head. I don't know about you, but I'd trip over something in about 6 seconds. The silence inside Eastern State became legendary. visitors frequently commented that the prison felt almost unnatural. Hundreds of prisoners lived behind its walls, yet the corridors remained eerily quiet. Guards spoke softly. Doors opened and closed with deliberate care. Conversations were kept to an absolute minimum. Some visitors admired the atmosphere. Others found it deeply unsettling. Word of this remarkable prison spread rapidly throughout Europe. Governments sent officials to Philadelphia to study the new system, hoping to copy it back home. Eastern State quickly became one of the most visited public institutions in America. Among its most important visitors were French officials Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont. Before Tocqueville became famous for writing Democracy in America, he and Beaumont toured American prisons, including Eastern State, to study different approaches to criminal justice. Their observations helped spread knowledge of the Pennsylvania system throughout Europe and influenced prison reform debates far beyond the United States. At first, many reports praised what they saw. Eastern State was cleaner than most prisons, better organized, less violent. Its architecture impressed visitors almost as much as its philosophy. But as the years passed, small cracks began appearing in the experiment. Not cracks in the stone walls, cracks in the human mind. Some prisoners handled isolation remarkably well, others did not. Prison records and historical accounts began documenting inmates who showed signs of severe emotional distress after spending long periods almost entirely alone. Some became withdrawn. Others experienced depression, anxiety, or confusion. A few reportedly suffered complete mental breakdowns. Prison officials didn't ignore these problems, but they often struggled to determine whether the isolation itself was responsible, or whether the prisoners had entered the institution with existing mental illnesses. 19th century medicine simply didn't understand psychology the way we do today. Then, in 1842, one visitor arrived whose opinion would echo through history. His name was Charles Dickens. Already one of the world's most celebrated authors, Dickens toured Eastern State during his American travels. He admired many aspects of the prison's cleanliness and organization, but he strongly condemned prolonged solitary confinement. In his published observations, Dickens argued that the psychological suffering caused by extreme isolation was a hidden form of torture, one that damaged the mind even if it left no visible scars. He believed the system punished people in ways that outsiders couldn't easily see. His criticism carried enormous weight. After all, this wasn't just another tourist complaining about the accommodations. This was one of the most famous writers on earth. And while prison officials defended their methods, public debate began growing louder. Had Eastern State created the world's most humane prison, or had it unknowingly created a different kind of suffering? Now, let's get into why you're all here. I know exactly how this works. I could spend 3 hours explaining prison reform, 19th century architecture, Quaker philosophy, and the evolution of American corrections. And somebody in the comments would still ask, "Yeah, but did you see a ghost?" Patience, my paranormal loving friends. We've built the foundation, and now it's time to explore why Eastern State Penitentiary has become one of the most famous haunted locations in America. But before we start blaming every strange noise on a ghost, let's remember where we're standing. This prison operated for 142 years. More than 75,000 men passed through these gates. Thousands experienced extreme isolation. Many died here from illness, old age, suicide, violence, or natural causes over more than a century of operation. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, that's a tremendous amount of human suffering packed into one place. Sometimes history alone can make a building feel haunted, and Eastern State has plenty of history. One inmate whose name everybody recognizes is the infamous Chicago gangster Al Capone. Believe it or not, Capone wasn't sent here for murder. He arrived in 1929 after being convicted in Philadelphia for carrying a concealed weapon. His stay only lasted several months before he was transferred, but it became one of the prison's most famous chapters. If you've ever toured Eastern State, you've probably seen the recreation of his cell. Compared to the bleak surroundings, it almost looks luxurious. Historical photographs and museum records show it was furnished with a rug, polished wooden furniture, artwork, and even a radio. Meanwhile, everyone else was living in something that looked like a medieval storage closet. Apparently, organized crime came with an interior decorating package. Capone himself later claimed he was haunted, not necessarily by Eastern State, but by the ghost of one of his most famous victims, James Clark, who had been murdered during the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre. According to stories that circulated after his imprisonment, Capone believed Clark's ghost followed him. Some reports claimed guards occasionally heard Capone yelling in his cell when nobody else was there. Others said he appeared genuinely frightened during parts of his incarceration. It remains one of the prison's best-known legends. As the prison sat abandoned after closing in 1971, something interesting happened. Nature moved in. Plants grew through cracked floors. Rain poured through collapsed roofs. Birds nested inside empty cell blocks. For nearly 2 decades, the prison slowly decayed. And that's when workers began sharing strange experiences. Maintenance crews restoring parts of the prison occasionally reported feeling watched. Some described hearing footsteps echoing through empty corridors. Others claimed they heard cell doors slam despite nobody else being nearby. Now, old buildings make noise, especially buildings this size. Stone expands, metal contracts, wind whistles through broken windows. If you've ever owned an old house, you know sometimes your home sounds like it's trying to have a conversation with itself. So hearing noises inside a 19th century prison isn't automatically evidence of the supernatural. But some stories are harder to explain. The location most visitors ask about is Cell Block 4. Over the years, numerous guests have reported an overwhelming feeling of being watched while walking through this section of the prison. Some say they suddenly felt cold despite warm temperatures. Others describe feeling someone brush against their shoulder. Several visitors have reported sensing someone standing directly behind them, only to turn around and find nobody there. Tour guides have also shared stories of hearing whispers while leading groups. Some visitors have even claimed they heard their names called. None of these experiences have been scientifically verified. But what's interesting is how similar many of the reports are, despite coming from people who don't know each other. Then there's Cell Block 6. Visitors frequently report seeing shadow-like figures darting across the ends of corridors. Not full-bodied apparitions. More like dark shapes disappearing just as quickly as they appear again. Lighting inside Eastern State can create strange visual effects. Sunlight streams through broken ceilings. Long hallways create unusual shadows. Your peripheral vision isn't always your friend. But these reports have become so common that Cell Block 6 has earned its own haunted reputation. Now let's talk about what many people consider the prison's most famous paranormal story, the locksmith. This account dates back to restoration work during the 1990s. According to stories repeated by Eastern State staff and featured on numerous paranormal television programs, a locksmith was assigned to remove an old lock from one of the cell doors. As he worked, he reportedly felt an intense force surge through the doorway. He later described seeing shadow-like figures emerging from the walls. Some accounts say he saw faces twisted in pain. Others describe multiple human-shaped forms reaching toward him. He reportedly became overwhelmed with terror and immediately left the area. It's one of the prison's best-known ghost stories. Eastern State has attracted nearly every major paranormal investigation team you can think of. Television crews have spent countless nights inside these walls. Investigators have captured unexplained knocking sounds, electronic voice phenomena, better known as EVPs, mysterious footsteps, and unusual fluctuations on electronic equipment. Believers argue these recordings capture evidence of spirits. Some of the most compelling witness stories actually come from everyday visitors. One woman reported walking through a cell block when she suddenly smelled strong cigar smoke. She turned to ask her husband if he smelled it too. He hadn't. Moments later, the smell vanished. Another visitor claimed he heard someone whisper directly into his ear while standing completely alone. He spun around expecting to find another tourist. The hallway was empty. Several photographers have claimed to capture unexplained figures in doorways, though investigators have generally found those images inconclusive or explainable through lighting, motion blur, or pareidolia. The tendency for our brains to recognize faces and human shapes in random patterns. Staff members have also shared unusual experiences over the years. Some have reported hearing footsteps late in the evening after visitors had gone home. Others describe doors moving unexpectedly or hearing distant voices echoing through empty corridors. Importantly, Eastern State itself does not claim these stories are proof of ghosts. The museum presents them as part of the site's folklore, while encouraging visitors to explore both the documented history and the legends that have grown around it. I actually respect that approach. They're not trying to convince you the place is haunted. They're simply saying, here's the history. Here's what people have reported. You decide. Walking through Eastern State today is an unforgettable experience, even if absolutely every ghost story turned out to have a perfectly ordinary explanation. I'd still say this is one of the eeriest places I've ever visited. The silence feels heavy. The abandoned cells stretch on forever. The sunlight pouring through broken ceilings somehow makes everything feel even lonelier. You don't need a ghost to imagine the thousands of men who once stood exactly where you're standing. Sometimes, the most unsettling thing isn't wondering whether spirits remain. It's realizing the suffering that unquestionably happened here. History leaves echoes. Whether those echoes are supernatural or simply emotional is a question every visitor has to answer for themselves. As for me, I'm just saying, if I hear somebody whisper my name in cell block 4, I'm not sticking around to ask for a second opinion. I'm suddenly becoming the fastest ghost hunter in Pennsylvania. If walls could talk, these wouldn't whisper. They'd tell enough stories to keep us standing here until sunrise. And somehow, I don't think we'd get bored listening.